This week on the Trucking Risk and Insurance Podcast, we go political. We have our guest, Mr. Mike McCarron. He states a few views that might be controversial, truthful, and political. I think you're going to find this episode really interesting. Stay tuned. Here comes Mike.
Welcome to the Trucking Risk and Insurance Podcast.
McCarron, Ace, welcome back to the Trucking Risk and Insurance Podcast. Can you, for our audience, introduce yourself, please?
My name is Mike McCarron. I'm a columnist at today's Trucking Magazine. I'm the partner at Left Lane Associates, supply chain M&A advisory firm. I'm president of Right Route Solutions, which is a third-party logistics company.
There you go. And from the latest reading, and I read it in Truck News, which of course is all part of the same organization that you are writing for, you have an opinion about the gig economy and how it all affects trucking. Do you want to elaborate on that?
Absolutely. It's nice to know that someone reads a column, so thanks, Chris. I think the first thing to mention is that I'm absolutely against people not paying source deductible. I don't like it. It absolutely infuriates me. I think of the taxes I paid over the years, both personally and corporately, and I really struggle with people not paying their taxes. But I think in reality, there comes a point where we have to accept the fact that this gig economy is not going anywhere. I had the pleasure of, being up in Ottawa recently with some business friends. We met some prominent members of the Liberal caucus, and it became pretty clear that the Liberals have botched this economy so bad under Trudeau's leadership that the only way to grow the gross domestic product is through immigration. It so happens that a lot of that immigration is coming from South Asia. They happen to like the trucking business, so that's their industry of choice. And it's just not going away. And they make that pretty clear to us. And, I cited in that column a recent report from H&R Block where there's almost 8 million Canadians making a living in the gig economy. I absolutely lost my mind when I read that a lot of them don't want to pay their taxes. And I think a lot of them, Frank, are working the gig economy to create multiple income streams just to kind of throw the cent off at CRA. So,
Well, one of the things in that article, in the H&R Block thing, and forgive me if I get the number wrong, was close to 50%. I think it was 44% said that the workers in the gig economy, many of them are willing to hide their income.
yeah, it just drives me insane because I look at the taxes that we're paying,
Yep.
what it in the past, and it's important to understand that I don't support this at all. And like my peers, my legacy carriers, I would be infuriated. But the reality is that I believe we've been played by the government. I believe that they haven't been straight with us. I think there comes a point where, both sides of this fence have to get together and really focus on the real enemy, which is the government, to bring some clarity. Just tell us what's right and what's wrong so we can react accordingly. This limbo land doesn't hurt anyone. It's bad for the economy, and it's bad for truckers who, as I said, don't really understand what they can and can't do because they've been played by the government. I really believe that.
Well, and I like the point that you had made in the article where I believe CTA was running ads. And, the ad said something about, hey, come work for trucking. We've got great work with benefits and all that kind of stuff. And then what happens, Mike?
Well, what happens is that to the outside world, the trucking company is a trucking company. They have no idea that there's really two industries operating within one industry, the legacy and the newcomer carriers. So they go and they run out and they go to 3 or 4 interviews, and all these promises that were made of stable income, benefits, unemployment insurance, vacation pay, good work environment, safety, training. They see none of that. So they show up at the interview and you got to incorporate. We're going to teach you. We're going to spend 50 hours teaching you how to drive a truck, which is basically enough to pass your license. and then we're going to throw you in a truck and you got to drive to Vancouver by yourself in the middle of the winter. And I had an Uber driver, ironically, coming back from the OTA convention, tell me that was an experience. So that's just back to the brand of trucking. I've always said that your brand is what people say about you when you leave the room. And so, they would have friends in a certain position that don't even bother applying because, what they basically are saying is that these truckers, they're breaking their promises. They promise this and they're delivering something else. And that's not a good thing for anyone.
It's really sad, to see this, because one of the biggest dilemmas, the thing that helps run this country is our tax base, right? We all contribute to that tax base so that we can have streetlights, police that help to protect us, schools, all this infrastructure that we need to have a really nice life to live on. And unfortunately, when we don't have everybody paying into the system, there are others that are going to pay way, way more.
100%. Look at the deficit that's being run under Trudeau. It's mind-boggling. There's no tax revenue. They're not collecting what's owed. I can't remember the exact stat, but I think there's like $28 billion you're not getting collected. Don't hold me to that, but it's a staggering number. And just to allow this to happen, there come a point where, you've got an election coming up and it's all about growth. And to think that a resource-driven economy like ours, we have to resort to this. So you look at something else that's interesting. So what's happening now is this nearshoring where, during COVID, prior to COVID, all the rage was, let's single source and make product cheap in China and Singapore and Vietnam. And, obviously people realized during COVID that's probably not the best. You need product near, supply chain disruption, and it's all coming back to North America, but it's not coming to Canada.
No. And I was going to say some of the stuff I've heard through the grapevine. So a couple of different things which aren't helping the situation by any means. So during the pandemic, we had the government paying out on CERB benefits. And I know for a fact there were a number of gig operators, and not just in trucking, but other industries as well, that collected CERB benefits. And sadly, they weren't eligible because they weren't paying into the system anyway. But because the government didn't have any checks and balances in place at the time, they just threw money out. These people collected. And a few of them have left and gone back home to their home country, and now somebody's looking to get that money recouped. So, but another one that is a real thorn in my side, to kind of touch on exactly where you're going, Mike, is the HST. So a lot of gig operators are charging HST to their company, but they're not submitting it to CRA. And I'm like going, whoa here. You just took a 13% wage increase when you shouldn't have been. So, and I really question why the government isn't auditing from that end coming up.
And let's just be clear. We're not just talking about trucking.
No,
here. We're talking in
anything.
general, the gig economy, when Mike says $28 billion not collected.
Yeah. And that's where it's compounded because no one can get workers. I think trucking gets it worse because it has a worse problem. Because so many South Asians, which is a lot of the immigration, want to be in the transportation business. They've got the roots, they got family and friends, places they worship. In Surrey, BC and Brampton, there's no such thing as a T4. And so that's the part that drives me insane is, that these people aren't contributing. They come to this country and they're not contributing to that, and it's unacceptable. But as I said, there comes a point, I think, with the trucking industry where, the leaders on both sides have to understand that being a part, and I don't put this on the associations. I think that Laskowski's done a great job trying to reach out. But it's a big carrots and leverage that are giving these people business. And I think that there's a lot of really good, a lot of transforming ex-gig companies are no longer, but a lot of ones are. I just think they've got to realize, I think they want some clarity too. And I just think that when you have two factions working against each other, you're letting the government off easy. And I think that, it's strength in numbers, and neither one of them really represents the trucking industry anymore. I think that the politicians are aware of that. They don't really think of driving as anything but the gig economy, and I think it's the only way you're ever going to give clarity to Canadian businessmen that are paying their taxes, that are source deductions, and are treating their drivers, and are updating their equipment, and it just goes on and on and on.
Well, I wonder how it's going to affect our Canadian government, the recent stance that the Biden administration took, where they appear to be cracking down on the independent operator. And of course, not everybody's happy with that stance, but how might that translate into Canadian? Will our government stand up and listen? And we often mirror what happens in the US.
Well, so that's a great question. So I find a couple things interesting about that. I don't think, first of all, kudos to Biden doing that. I frankly don't think it's a bigger problem in the United States than trucking business, the gig economy. But I don't think the government, certainly the input that we got, the businessmen I was with, from prominent members of the Liberal caucus, was they have absolutely no desire to chase independent contractors, zero. Well, what I do find interesting is, the ATA and both TCA went on record recently in early January to say that they oppose Biden's ruling, which talks about independent contractors. So certainly goes against what the Canadian legacy and associations are saying. But interesting enough, there's a lot of Canadian leaders that are actually involved with TCA. So it will be really interesting to see, because it's a real different stance. And, just my opinion, I think that's their way of saying that, recognizing that we have a huge driver shortage problem, and that's the only way that this can happen. The only thing I can think of is that, with the U.S. being very political, the TCA and truck owners are Republicans. So, when you're dealing with the states, there's always a political oversight. So my take on the United States these days is that it's very hard to apply rational thinking sometimes to irrational thinking. And I don't know what's driving that, but it's very interesting, the stance. It's very interesting.
Yeah. Well, one of the other things that we're noticing is we're losing drivers. Attrition is one issue. So guys are retiring and whatnot, but we're also seeing a lot of drivers that are just thick of the industry now. Lack of pay, lack of adequate pay, lack of training. I think we're seeing a lot of senior drivers, very well experienced and seasoned drivers, that are just afraid to be on the road anymore, because a lot of these companies are quick to just throw a driver in the truck and send him to Vancouver when he's got no previous experience. And now these guys are going, I don't want to risk my life because of the other driver. So that's causing us grief.
Well, I agree. I think when a professional driver watches his peers that are having trouble backing in to a warehouse, knowing that they're hooking and going to California, I'd be terrified too.
Yeah.
And I think to your point, John, I talk to every Uber driver who's Ubering it in, and how many of them have awful experiences in trucking? It's embarrassing.
Yep. Just imagine.
I've tried to get a couple go on record for my column, and they don't really want to do it.
Yeah. Well, back in the day, and I'll use, when I was growing up as a young lad, and I was driving in the early 80s there, it was a different mindset back then. It was a career. My family was truck drivers, my grandfather, my uncles, my dad, so it's like, yeah, I want to be a truck driver. And this was a career model. This wasn't just a job, and you took that to heart, and away you went. And if you weren't good when you started, well, no problem. You practiced. You got out there. The company you were working for would say, cool, go out in the yard and just back trailers in. That'll teach you how to back up. Go talk to Bob here. Bob will give you some tips on what to do. I don't see that anymore. And I don't see anybody wanting to bend over backwards and give that assistance. It's more the companies are more, go, you got to get in the truck. I'm paying you. Go, 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 go.
I think the legacy carriers are doing a great job of training. I think the drivers are safer than ever, but There's less and less of them. And, I pushed really hard when I was chairman of Trucking HR Canada to make driving a skilled labor.
Mhm. Mhm.
You need to get a license to be a hairdresser, to frame a house.
Mhm.
But the problem we have is the industry, and once again, largely driven by newcomers, they advertise as don't need any skills.
Mhm.
It's when the government sees that, we're saying your industry is saying that you don't need skills, but you're saying you need skills.
Yeah.
And
And we're saying it's a skilled job to be
Yeah.
a truck driver.
Yeah.
I
Well,
sat,
let's take that analogy you just used, because I did some research about a year ago on this. So the hairdresser, in order to be a hairdresser in Canada, you have to have a license, right? And you have to obtain what's called your Red Seal certificate. Well, interesting enough, it takes almost 4,000 hours to get your hair certificate. And, you know, 400 of those hours are done in the beginning in a classroom environment. And then the rest of it is done through an apprenticeship program to cut hair. Yet I can go just take a 103.5 hour course here in Ontario, and I can get my truck driving license, and I can drive an 18,000-pound missile down the road. What's wrong with this situation?
it's absurd. Like, think of a hairdresser. So the worst case scenario, you cut someone's ear off. Big deal.
Yeah,
Big
I
deal.
can still hear. I'm gonna be okay.
In the trucking industry, the worst case scenario is humbles.
Yes.
You
Yeah.
know?
Oh my God. Yes. No, it's, as I said, it's and it's getting worse, and it's getting worse. And that's one reason I talked about this getting together, because to me, the taxes you can't control. You can fight government, you can force them to make a decision. And that's all we want as businessmen. Tell me what I can and can't do and get me out of limbo land. But the focus should be on the unsafe roads, the immigration scams, the human resources scams. It's mind-boggling what's going on. And, I know a lot of the gig operators, we use them a lot in Right Route. There's some fantastic people, some good businessmen, but I just wish they would pay their taxes, but they're embarrassed by their underbelly. They know it's criminal, and
Yeah.
they're not. And to me, that's not doing anything but a travesty. It's a travesty itself.
I wonder, in the gig economy, far wider than just trucking, what does CRA do to see if they're actually issuing T4A slips like CRA says they're supposed to? Do you know if there's any audit process, Mike?
No, I don't think so. Based
Yeah.
on the lack of funds that are being collected, I don't know anyone that's been audited. I don't know anyone that's been fined. Like, you think of their fine system, it's hilarious. So they have this big announcement, Seamus O'Regan, that was the enforcement one. We're going to fine any people that don't pay their source deductions, 250 grand. Now, it doesn't matter how many trucks you have, which is absurd. But you do the math on that. So based on what I read from some very reputable truckers, they believe that not paying source deductions presents about a 20% cost saving, meaning that the level, they have an unfair advantage for 20%. So do a mid-sized truck running legal these days, a couple 100,000 miles. So it's $40,000 a truck. So that tells me that as long as you have more than 6 trucks as independent contractors, you're making money. It's just, so you can get, there's gig economy carriers that are $300, $400, $500 million now. It's just it's a recruiting firm. Cost of doing business. The owner's expense account is bigger than that, and they business. And
I had the opportunity to speak with some folks from ESDC, and sadly, the $250,000 fine is highly unlikely to be reached or offered, from what they told me, because the first visit, if they're going in to do an audit or an inspection, the first visit is going to be educational. There's no fines. It's all educational. They're going to be advising you what you need to be doing. And then they'll come back in 30 days and see if you're doing it. And if they're not, well, then there's a small penalty, somewhere around $5,000, maybe $10,000. And then from there, it goes to court. It takes several visits of this person or this company not following the rule before they would ever get to $250,000. And they say it would probably take several years before they would actually issue a fine that high.
And
They were talking about 2 audits they were working on, which each company was fined a total of $20,000 each. And
even in the worst case scenario that they shut them down, the drivers are just going to work for someone else. It's absolutely, it's pandering to the nth degree, just absolute pandering. And that's what has to stop. And the only way that I think that's going to stop is the big guys, the big carriers have to get together and force a decision. Our country's going to get, at this stage, that article from H&R Block basically stated that the gig economy has doubled in the past year. Double. We're going to be bankrupt. We're going to be Argentina.
Mhm.
How do you run a country when people aren't paying their fair share of taxes?
Yep, exactly.
And it said in the article that a good part of that, they were doing it so that they didn't have to pay taxes,
Amen.
about 50%.
Mhm.
So,
Yep.
and I'll put a link to that article in the show notes down below, because I found it really enlightening. The rapid growth of the gig economy and the tax implications of that economy. And it's something I think we should all be concerned, at least all legal tax paying people should be concerned about.
100%. I'm very concerned. When you have 28% of your employees engaging in activities that don't pay taxes, and it's doubling every year, you have a problem. And they're just like, when we went to Ottawa, like it's like they brush it off like it's nothing. And a few of the, I can't say who's with me, but these are far more important senior people I am. And, they're facing the same challenges and theirs and in their industries. And the one thing that we learned in Ottawa was that Trudeau is God, and what he says goes, and it's just about getting reelected. It's why they legalized pot, because they want to get the use. So it's about getting reelected. And, I thought his old man was bad. He is 10 times worse. I just don't know how they can continue to run this economy in this country with such a deficit, with so many people are turning a blind eye to their fiduciary of just contributing to staying in this country.
Well, and it's just going to get worse for the simple fact that if you've got young people in this gig approach and they're wanting this gig approach to put more money in their own pocket, I have my doubts they're investing it into their retirement savings plans. And therefore, without doing your tax deductions, you're not submitting to CPP as well. So as these folks get older, that's going to put a larger burden on this country to try and deal with social services down the road when they get sick and healthy. And, you're not contributing. So now our healthcare program is going to be falling apart. We're not going to have money to support it.
Corey, what do you mean our healthcare program is going to be falling apart?
Well, more than what it is already.
Which is largely a provincial problem, but they get a lot of their funds from the federal government. But anyhow, this is, we got to wrap this up in a few minutes. The gig economy, I think we all agree, is hurting Canadians generally and really hurting tax-paying Canadians.
Absolutely.
Mike, did we cover everything that you wanted to hit? And I know we had that technical difficulty in the middle, but did we hit all the topics that you wanted to address?
Oh, I think so. The bottom line is, I think that, at the end of the day, all we ask for as Canadians, all we ask for as tax paying Canadians, all we ask for as a trucking industry is give us some clarity, don't pander, and let us know what we need to do properly to run our business. And that's just not happening. And I call on our great friends in the trucking industry to step up, to really focus on the real enemy, because the enemy that they're focusing on is doing something that I don't agree with, but they're taking advantage of lack of enforcement. And we really need to focus on who's causing this, which is our folks in Ottawa.
Yeah, I'm going to say the gig economy is not going anywhere soon, but it would be nice if it was taxed appropriately. That would be my
Fair taxes.
Yeah. Hey, Mike, I really appreciate this. Was a politically charged discussion.
Take care. Great talking to you, pal. Take care.